We're reviewing the Intel Core Ultra 9 285K CPU. We're going to start with the name. Actually, we'll start with this. Take a look at this giant, spiky ATX 12-volt line for the 285K on this chart compared to the 14900K. This is going to be a problem for our power testing process today and efficiency testing. It's not as simple as just measuring the EPS 12-volt cables because the differences from the 24-pin aren't just going to be the sort of normal margin of error. It's a lot bigger than that, at least on ASUS. We had to build this monstrosity to isolate the power consumption of the CPU for Arrow Lake because ASUS is pulling significant power down the ATX 24-pin connector this time, and not just the EPS 12-volt cables. For context, if we didn't do all this, the 285K would look like basically the most efficient CPU Intel has ever made. It's a big difference in how the results get interpreted. If it's been a while since you've checked in, you can think of the 285K as a 15900K, the 245K as a 15600K, and the 265 as a 15700K or something. So they've changed the naming a bit. Now, Intel's big claim is that the power consumption on these CPUs is halved. So we'll spend a lot of time testing that. We're also looking at the usual gaming and production performance. Production's a little more interesting from a competitive standpoint because in gaming, Intel with the 285K is up against not only the lowest prices that we've seen for the 14 and 13 series, but relatively competitive prices for the most part from AMD. For the 7800X3D and the 5700X3D, kind of asterisk there because when the 7800X3D sells out, it gets scalped for crazy prices. And then there's the 9800X3D, literally days away at this point. So it's gonna be a tough fight for Intel. Let's get into it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermaltake and the Tower 600 case. The Tower 600 is a vertical case design with Thermaltake's unique showcase presentation, which stands out further with its separate chassis stand kit that rotates the case for an angled showpiece. The Tower 600 is heavily ventilated around the sides, has a ton of radiator support including up to 420mm solutions, and offers 2 GPU mounting options for display and cooling optimization. It also comes in colors not commonly seen in cases. Learn more about the Tower 600 at the link in the description below. We'll start with a roundup of the current pricing landscape. We put this table of prices together a few days before launch, so the exact prices may be different when this video goes live. The 285K is $630 from Newegg, which is about $40 over the $590 list price on the slides. Now, it's possible that price comes down a little bit for launch. It's also possible that some of the other prices move up before launch. However, because chronomancers haven't been a part of the core rule set for D&D since Advanced D&D version 2, as it's known today, we have no way to go into the future and review that instead. So we're gonna stay here and review the present, which will be the past when you're watching. You know what, just never mind. The 285K is $630 with the pre-order pricing, or $160 more than the 14900K right now. Now, we don't care about what the launch MSRP was of those prior parts because it's irrelevant. What they're priced at today is what you would be looking at if you were going to buy one. The 14700K is $350 to $375, the 137 is $290 in some places, the 12900K is down to $280, and the much weaker, of course, 12600KF is now $160, which we only put here because that's kind of crazy compared to its launch. Buying into these dead platforms isn't a great feeling though, so we can also look at AMD's direct alternatives, which include the $480, at least right now, 7800X3D with a rumored 9800X3D in a week. So if that's true, we'll have more to say soon. The 285K is 31% more money than the 7800X3D, at least when it's priced properly. We've seen it go kind of crazy lately to like 600, and that doesn't make sense. And on the other side of the flank, it's got the 9950X and the 7950X for production. For the absolute bare bones basics, what you need to know is that this code name is Arrow Lake. It's the Core Ultra 200 series. They've moved to a tile-based approach, meaning that the silicon, if you were to take the lid off, is no longer a monolithic piece of silicon. Also, Intel is working with TSMC on manufacturing for this one, so that's kind of unique too. Intel has gotten rid of hyperthreading and is instead moving to just P cores and E cores with these CPUs. So the 285K has 8 P cores and 16 E cores with 24 threads against the 14900K's 32 total threads. Frequency is also down, now at 5.7 gigahertz advertised, but because the architectures are different, it's not that clean to just compare the frequency numbers. We'll review the 245K next, but that one's at 6 P cores and 8 E cores. The new platform is LGA 1851 and it requires new motherboards. These will not work in LGA 1700 socket motherboards, and LGA 1700 CPUs will not work in LGA 1851 boards. There are also multiple independent loading mechanism options chosen by motherboard manufacturers. We'll have a separate video shortly with laser scans and pressure maps of those, check back for that, and more specs on the basics can be found in our Arrow Lake announcement coverage that we'll link below. Getting into the review. So first off, Arrow Lake is really not ready for launch. They fumbled a number of things here leading into launch. And as an example, Intel told us this in a briefing. Quote, the big change is that every ODM now, without fail, every ODM ships with this, or APO in this conversation, enabled. In the BIOS, the Camarillo device is turned on, there will be a yellow bane, the driver will install, and APO will be enabled by default. That's the out-of-the-box experience everybody is going to have. You'd want to mimic what folks are going to see, talking about the testing. This is going to be something that's going to be probably just as important as the hardware improvements. All your ODMs, the board vendors, it's all enabled by default and should auto-install, 13th gen onward. Now this is important because we don't test with APO, so we had to consider it for this review. Intel presented first-party benchmark slides with APO enabled and emphasized with us that not only would it be on by default on Z890, but that it would also be on by default with Z790. Neither was true. We discovered this issue and brought it to Intel only because we weren't sure if it was something we did wrong, and it wasn't. The company seemed totally unaware of this failing, and after some back and forth, it realized eventually that it had simply screwed up. As a result of our findings, Intel is moving to publish a list of motherboards that support APO out of the box on by default in BIOS going forward. But our concern is that clearly things are not fully ready here. If the statement was, without fail, a feature would be on by default, and then it's not, and we're the ones who find out about it, and they respond to that. So that's just, we're not really supposed to be beta testing it. That's not a great sign. But dynamic tuning also no longer existed on our board, despite Intel telling us that that's what needs to be enabled. The option we found has been renamed to Innovation Platform Framework, and it was off by default, which meant APO was off for the 200 series. With the latest BIOS and microcode for Z790 and a brand new Windows install, we also found APO was off. So from a methodology perspective, we consider APO a non-default feature in the state the product is in now. We review what we receive. We don't review promises of the future. See earlier reference of Chronomancer 1995 TSR publication. I believe it was version 1.2. But also seriously, we don't review the future or promises. That it doesn't make any sense. So, even with it on, though, which we did test, it was ultimately irrelevant in the test suite. Didn't really matter much. It's more of an indicator. It was one of many unforced errors from Intel, which included blue screens of death on Windows installed due to driver conflict with NVIDIA devices when the IGP is disabled. This issue didn't exist on prior architectures. Seems to be a combination of the new IGP claiming PCIe resources and of NVIDIA's driver code not having an error handler for zero PCIe resource allocation. You can bypass it by disabling the IGP, but for a lot of people, this is going to be frustrating. The platform also has issues with easy anti-cheat, which Intel will soon be publishing a statement about. We'll leave that to Wendell's coverage, but basically, if you disable security features, you're able to work around the issue. We just wouldn't recommend it. Additionally, Intel sent a statement out about power profiles where balanced power on 24H2 results in uncharacteristically bad performance. We test with high performance, except we're specifically required to use balanced in some X3D situations, so this didn't affect us, but it is another one of many of Intel's launch problems. Intel even got its own specs wrong on this slide, where it said the chipset can support up to 32 USB 3.2 devices, but actually it's supposed to be 10. This is something that Taiwanese publication Unico's Hardware spotted previously. As we said, Arrow Lake's really just not ready for launch. The numbers are what's really important here, including efficiency, because that's what Intel makes big claims about. So to keep it short, on at least the Z890 motherboard we have, the 24-pin power connector is now far more relevant than it has been in the past. So it's been a little relevant, but typically those numbers come out in the noise of data, and now the 24-pin is doing disproportionate work. It's likely a board-to-board thing and not Arrow Lake as an architecture as a whole, but we need to look at that. So let's get into that part. Proving our work, this plot shows the 14900K's power draw on a known workload spread across multiple rails. You can see that EPS1 and EPS2 power is similar, both around 70 to 80 watts in this lighter weight gaming workload. The 24-pin connector has several voltages, including 3.3, 5V standby, and 12V for the things that are shown here. The ATX 12V rail includes things like fans, and if we hadn't isolated it, slot power, among other miscellaneous controllers on motherboards. PCIe slot power is at around 30 to 35 watts, which is why it's important to isolate it if capturing 24-pin power. Here's why we isolate slot power. This benchmark was for 7-zip on the 14900K. We'll come back to the 285K. The GPU does literally nothing in this test except for spit out display. It doesn't engage in the test. However, occasionally in any test, we measure seemingly random spikes to slot power. It could be for a number of unpredictable reasons, such as Windows background tasks or NVIDIA's drivers doing something in the background, like telemetry. Here's the comparison we've all wanted. In 7-zip, ignoring EPS 12V, we noticed that the ATX 12V power was exceptionally high on the 285K and the Z890 Hero combination compared to the 14900K and Z790 Hero. It's at about 50 watts here, whereas the 14900K had ATX 12V down around 30 watts. ATX 3V power is comparable on both and within 2 watts of each other. ATX 5V isn't easy to call a simple average. It fluctuates a lot. The range, though, is 14 to 30 watts on the 285K and ASUS combination, and similar on the 14900K, with peaks about 3 to 5 watts lower than on the 285K. We don't know if ASUS is using any of that power to feed things like maybe regulators that go to the CPU or something, but if any of it is, it's not much. A lot of it is driving other components like I/O. The ATX 12V line is clearly important, though, as not factoring in that 20 to 30 watt difference in this test would mean representing the 285K as artificially efficient because the power is sort of hidden in a cable where it's not typically meaningfully high and where we wouldn't normally look. ASUS's reasoning for this is theoretically better power regulation. We don't know if any other board vendors are doing this. Finally, as an example of AMD, here's the 7800X3D and 285K. The 285K and 14900K ATX 12V remained from last time. The 7800X3D was pulling about 12 watts, ATX 12V fixed during this test, and didn't seem to fluctuate based on load at all. It appears fairly isolated. Typically, this gap of 10 watts comes out in the wash when you're talking about a 280 watt 14900K versus an 80 watt 7800X3D, so it's just the usual part of the margins. It's never really been relevant before. In this scenario, however, the difference against the 285K really starts to show. Here's ATX 3V. The 7800X3D platform is marginally higher here. We're using an ASUS board for this also. This is part of why 5V normally comes out in the wash. Some rails are a few watts higher, some are a few watts lower. There's always going to be error. ATX 5V is about the same between them all. There's spikier behavior on the 285K from the I/O, but that's about it. All this is done with hardware. We also can't trust various software readings because they can be manipulated heavily by software or by the motherboards. Years ago, there was an issue where AMD motherboards were underreporting some of the power line items in a way that allowed boards to pull more or less power while hiding it in software depending on what they were trying to manipulate. We also spoke with Der Bauer about his experiences, and he noticed that CPU package power is calculated based on seemingly VID, so if anything's wrong with the voltage or tweaked, it can manifest in erroneous software readings. That's why we use this monster that we built to do all of this. We're fairly confident in the results, but we have to caveat that this is a very opaque platform pre-launch right now, and it's not fully clear how all the power is being routed. For the most part, it should be proportional to the VRM split anyway of 18 to 4 of the 22 phases total. So we were able to use that as a guidepost as well. Now, finally, you might be asking, who measures the measurers? The answer is us. We measure the measurers. So working with Elmore, we set up multiple current monitoring devices to test them against each other. So we used a PMD, a PMD2, a bench lab, and then not from Elmore, we used a straightforward Fluke current clamp. And using all of that, we were able to evaluate the current, determine which devices were producing the most reliable results, and then proceed with those for testing. So let's get into the efficiency. 7-zip decompression efficiency is measured in MIPS per watt, or millions of instructions per joule, if you simplify it. In this test, the 285K ended up in the lower third of the chart. Intel's 14900K pulled 273 watts for this benchmark, with the 285K now at 162 watts for ATX 12V and EPS 12V without the slot power for the GPU, or 175 watts if we look at the ATX 12V and the ATX 5V with EPS 12V. We think the 162 watt number is more accurate, but we want to transparently present both since the power split is still not fully clear. Because performance is lower and the formula relies on both, the efficiency increase isn't as impressive as the power drop is. The 285K runs with an efficiency of 1101 MIPS per watt decompression, with the reading that includes 5 volts for that one, which results in an improvement of 29% over the 14900K. The reading without 5 volts is 40% improved over the 14900K for efficiency, which we think, again, is the more accurate of the two. Whether 30% or 40% is more precise, the point is that it's a big uplift. AMD still dominates here, holding the entire top third of the chart, though. The 7950X in eco mode sets a seemingly untouchable score at 1936 MIPS per watt, and then the 7800X3D, which is much slower than the 285K and 7-zip decompression scoring, is more efficient thanks to its 70-watt power draw. Here's the 7-zip compression result. Power consumption is measured across compression and decompression of the same test suite, so those figures are unchanged. The 285K scored 1051 MIPS per watt with ATX 12 volt and EPS 12 volts, which is an improvement over the 14900K's 672 MIPS per watt of 56%. This uplift versus decompression comes from a higher performance in 7-zip compression scoring in terms of relative scaling versus where it lands in decompression. We'll talk about that later. AMD 7800X3D is at the top here. Again, it's not the best performer, but its 70 watt power is impressive, and that allows it to remain the true most efficient CPU we've tested recently in a desktop. Baldur's Gate 3 could get a lot more complicated. We have, however, isolated out the PCIe slot power by using an interposer to power the video card instead. The entire X3D lineup continues its domination in this game, and most others. The high frame rate and low power land the 7800X3D at 2.3 FPS per watt, as it's pulling only 55 watts during this workload for gaming. The 5700X3D is about the same, with the 5800X3D slightly less efficient. Intel's new 285K isn't remotely close to these numbers. The 285K with ATX 12 volt and EPS 12 volt ran at 1.1 FPS per watt, so the 7800X3D is creating over 2 times as many frames per watt of power here. And even with some overage for some sort of fudge factor on a couple watts here and there that might not be filtered or accounted for, the 7800X3D is still just, it's basically unapproachable at this point. The 14900K ran at 0.7 FPS per watt here. Looking at just Intel, the 1.1 result of the 285K has at least improved substantially over the 14900K, with an uplift of 57%. If we include the 5-volt power, since we're not certain if any of it is being used for the CPU or how much, that would be a 29% uplift instead. Starfield is a heavier workload from gaming. In this one, the 7800X3D is again the most efficient. Its result was 2.1 FPS per watt, holding a large lead over the closest CPUs that are up behind it. The next closest would be the 5700X3D, also at about 70 watts. The 5800X3D, 9700X, and 7700 non-X follow this, and we eventually hit the 3700X and then the 285K. With the ATX 12 volt and EPS 12 volt measurements and without the PCIe slot, we end up at about 147 watts for a 1.0 FPS per watt rating, with some of the usual rounding in there. The 14900K ran at 0.7 FPS per watt here, so Intel has improved by 43%. Its Ultra 9 is now where the 14600K was previously, measuring 5 volts as well, had it at 172 watts or 0.8 FPS per watt. That would instead be an improvement of 14%. As before, we believe it's somewhere in the middle here, but probably closer to that 1.0 figure. The next game is Stellaris, where we measured simulation time in seconds and power. In order to make this as easy to follow as possible, we've done some simple arithmetic to convert this into simulations per watt hour, meaning that a bigger number is better, despite the base metric result being lower is better. That's because you want to simulate more things with a watt hour. The 7800X3D has an impressive score here at 2.7 simulations per watt hour. The next closest is down at 2.4 with the 5700X3D. The 285K ran 1.5 simulations per watt hour. That means for each watt hour, the 7800X3D is able to complete 1.2 more simulations, or about an 80% increase. The 14900K completed 0.9 simulations per watt hour. That means the 285K's best entry is an improvement of 67% in efficiency. Remember, most of Intel's presented numbers were only for power reductions, not necessarily for efficiency. The 285K's simulation performance is better than the 14900K's in this benchmark, so its combination of higher performance and lower power, which was reduced by a total of 46.6 watts from the 14900K, so that falls basically, once you look at Intel doing total system power, it's sort of exactly within their geo-mean expectation. This yields the huge increase that we're seeing in efficiency, though. Finally, Final Fantasy XIV for efficiency. In this one, the 7800X3D led with an impressive 42.5 watts power draw while spewing hundreds of frames per second, allowing it a result of 8.3 FPS per watt. That's great. The 5700X3D keeps its second place spot at 7.7. The 14900K ran at 3.1 FPS per watt, so the 285K at its sort of best is 32% improved by these numbers. This is one where the 285K was regressive in performance against the 14900K, and by sort of a lot. We'll come back to that in the FPS results, but because the FPS is down for this one, the result is reduced efficiency gains despite also being reduced power. Next, we'll validate the frequency behavior to establish how the CPUs behave out of the box. This chart plots the highest single-core frequency per interval during a single-threaded Cinebench workload. With the 285K, the max single-core frequency is 5700 MHz during this test, with frequent drops to 5400 MHz. These drops are abnormal on Intel during this testing. The 14900K with the latest microcode held 6000 MHz. These are different architectures architecture, so it's not as simple as stating that higher is better, but it will help illustrate where some of the performance losses are coming from later. The original launch microcode for the 14900K had it at the same frequency. This chart looks at P-core frequency averages during Blender. The 285K maintains an average P-core frequency of 5400 MHz in this testing. It's also relatively flat. That has it higher than the 2024 ASUS test entry, which is what we use for our review comparison today at around 5100 to 5220 MHz. The 2023 launch entry was higher at 5280 to 5400 MHz on average. The microcode changes may have affected this since launch, though. That's the point of doing these. The MSI 0x11D microcode entry had the CPU at around 5000 MHz from the same window as the ASUS 2023 entry. We never used that board in any of our reviews process, so this is new data with old microcode, and the most up-to-date frequency entry sits between the two flanks of the early 14900K tests. Finally, this chart shows all core averages in the same test. The 285K averaged 4867 MHz when factoring in the E-cores, with the modern 14900K just below 4500 MHz and flanked by the two older entries. Now we're getting to gaming benchmarks. We have a lot of 2023 and 2024 games in this test suite with a couple of mainstays from the past. Dragon's Dogma 2 is up now. This is one of the 2024 titles we added to our suite last time. It's had updates that affect performance significantly since our last round of benchmarks, so this is all new data, like everything else here. APO doesn't do anything in this benchmark and isn't supported. We tested it with on and off for the 14900K and 285K, and its performance was the same. So we removed the redundant entries here because they have no impact. We didn't want to take the chart space. The 285K landed at about 104 FPS average, with lows at 64 and 51. This allows the AMD 7800X3D at $480 to lead the $590 285K by 6.1%, with the 14900K leading at 5% over the 285K. The lows between these three CPUs are functionally identical, so there's no explicit advantage there. The 14700K and 13700K also lead the 285K here, with the 14700K far cheaper at $350. Not even close. The 5700X3D and 5600X3D are effectively tied, with the 5700X3D at $230 right now, or sometimes down closer to $200, depending on where you buy it. In F124, which for hopefully obvious reasons is a 2024 title, we end up with this set of results when fully retested in 24H2 and with the new microcode and AGISA for everything. The 7800X3D sets a ceiling pretty high and establishes a 28% lead over the more expensive and higher power consuming 285K at 438 FPS to 344 FPS average. The 14900K is also advantaged, this time by 12%, with a 385 FPS result. The lows for the 285K were 186 FPS 1%, which is a worse entry than the 14900K's 250 result. The frame time pacing appears better in step with the average on both the 14900K and the 7800X3D. Looking now at the APO results, toggling APO appears to do something in this game. The 285K gained 1.3% with APO on, so that's very exciting. We can hardly contain ourselves. I'm trying to keep it in right now. You'll surely notice the extra 3 to 4 frames per second on top of the other 343 before them, and we're glad that we spent half a day troubleshooting Intel's fumbled pre-launch settings to gain those frames back, because whatever would we have done without the extra 0.0369 milliseconds reduction in frame time if we had not troubleshot that for half a day. So that was phenomenally exciting. The 14900K also gained about the same amount. It is irrelevant on both. Using DDR5 8600 on the 285K with Gear 2 and blasted VDIM boosted the 359 FPS average result we see here. That's a 4.5% like-for-like lead over the 344 result. This is almost enough to get the 285K tied with the 2-generation-old 13700K from 2022, but not quite. It does, however, tie it with AMD's 2020 architecture found in the cache-boosted 5700X3D with its lower power. 1440p results are mostly uninteresting. The top is truncated heavily because of the increase in resolution. Even still, the new Ultra 9 ends up in the middle. It's fitting that the Core Ultra 9 is in the middle of a cluster here. Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail is up now. This is another 2024 addition to our testing. The 7800X3D again establishes the ceiling. It leads the 285K by 31% in this game at 353 FPS to 270. The 14900K's 310 FPS average establishes a 15% lead over the 285K, marking one of the largest declines in Intel's performance in our gaming suite. The 5800X3D and 5600X3D are also at the top here, showing that Dawntrail generally likes cache, at least on these CPUs. The 5700X3D is a little bit lower down since its frequency is 300 megahertz below that of the 5600 X3D. So these results make sense, but it shows that Dawntrail is also sensitive to the frequency. The 285K ends up below the 14700K and 13700K, with APO doing nothing on the 285K. It's within error. Final Fantasy XIV is officially supported by APO though, and it's on the games list. And we do see a slight uplift on the 14900K of 1%, although that's basically error. Switching to DDR5 8600 on the 285K provided an uplift of 4%, with it still below the 13700K after that. Of course, the same memory treatment would lift the others up also. It'd just be an arms race. At 1440p, its limited ceiling is shuffling the stack as a result of the frame rate bouncing off of other limitations. We saw a 1.9% uplift from APO on the 14900K. The 285K, again, did not benefit from APO, with both entries at 255 FPS average, plus or minus 1 FPS. Baldur's Gate 3 is up now, a 2023 title that we added to our permanent test suite this year. We test an Act 3 in a densely populated city for a heavy CPU load. The 7800 X3D establishes a 26% lead over the 285K at 126 FPS to 100 FPS average. The 14900K leads the 285K by 4.5% at about 105 FPS average. The 5800 X3D, 57 X3D, and 56 X3D also lead the 285K, as do the 13900K, 13700K, and 14700K. Toggling APO did nothing here, and was within variance for both the 14900K and 285K. Swapping to DDR5 8600 memory boosted the 285K by 7.6%, allowing it to pass everything except the X3D CPUs. This also perfectly aligns with why X3D does so well here. Of course, shoving better memory into the 14900K or 9000 series would also boost them fairly proportionally. Stellaris is up next. First up, APO has no impact in this game, at least not in the simulation time. The 285K required 32.5 seconds for the simulation, finally putting it ahead of the 14900K. The 285K requires 1 to 2% less time than the 147 and 14900K CPUs. The 7800 X3D outranks the 285K again and requires about 3.7% less time for the work. The 9700X remains the fastest here, which is consistent with our last round of data, and boosting memory helps in this game, so the 285K benefited from a 4.3% reduction in time to complete the simulation. Rainbow Six Siege is up next. In this one, the 7800 X3D leads by a much smaller amount at only 6.6% for 622 versus 584 FPS average when APO is in its default off position that this board shipped in. The 14900K was tied. Enabling APO did nothing on the 285K. The result was within error when considering we're at almost 600 FPS anyway. Enabling it boosted the 14900K by 1.7%, and this is with Intel's shitty Microsoft Store app confirming that it's enabled for both CPUs. This boost is reduced for the 14900K versus APO's launch because Rainbow Six has updated the code that was causing problems. Going to DDR5 8600 increased performance over the 584 result by 2.6%. The 285K is at least better than the 14700K in this one, with an uplift of 2% when looking at the stock entries. It's also about 1.8% ahead of the 7700 non-X, which has been $280 to $290 when you can still find it. As a general note, this game has some serious 0.1% low consistency issues actually. We noticed that the 12 to 14 series CPUs have significantly higher 0.1% lows than AMD's options, and then the 285K alike, so it's easier to look at a frame time plot. Here it is. Because Intel noted that Rainbow Six had specifically tuned to reduce reliance on APO, and because of the low advantage of Alder Lake onward, we're assuming that Rainbow Six Siege has specific and manual tuning by the developers for Alder Lake architecture and its more recent derivatives. This frame time plot shows the 14900K is overall highly consistent frame to frame, with most of the intervals deviating at most by 2 milliseconds. There are a few spikes, but only one notable spike to 6 milliseconds, which is a 4 millisecond deviation, and thus it wouldn't be noticed by the vast majority of users. Adding the 285K, we see several spikes to 10 to 11 milliseconds. By themselves, these frame times aren't bad. 60 FPS would be 16.67 milliseconds, so this isn't a huge stall, but it's a change from Raptor Lake, and it's objectively worse. In Starfield, another 2023 game, the 7800 X3D maintains a 2% advantage over the 285K at 145.4 to 142.5 FPS average. Normally, we wouldn't read the decimal points, but here they are significant to showing any kind of percent scale. We're bound elsewhere here, and that elsewhere is is obvious and pretty cool, actually. The DDR5 8600 result jumps to the top of the chart, illustrating that at least some of our limit here is memory. As a reminder, applying the memory tuning treatment to everything would boost all numbers. So looking at baseline will give you an idea for sort of their headroom plus the baseline. The 14900K actually falls behind for once. It's at a slight loss to the 285K. We think this corresponds with the cache advantages based on the memory performance that we just saw, where it's really using cache and memory. APO, once again, does nothing between the two main 285K entries. Total War Warhammer 3 is up now. The 7800X3D led the 285K by 7.2%, with the 14900K leading by 2.8%. Total Warhammer 3 is on the APO list, so it is supported. On the 14900K, we saw an uplift of about 1.2%. If that's considered supported, then great. On the 285K, we measured an improvement of 0.6%, which is actually just within the run-to-run variance. Lows in this game have been historically awful on Intel's i9 CPUs, which we previously proved is due to scheduling challenges with the thread count. The 285K seems to at least somewhat improve here, possibly by reduction in threads. And this is something that we've seen historically. We looked at this back in Alder Lake. We're getting to production benchmarks now. We'll run through these pretty fast. So Blender's up first. We've updated it. It's not comparable to the previous results. The 285K is our second highest performer on the charts for desktop class CPUs. The 9950X benefits from a render time reduction of 5.6% against the 285K, while the 285K reduces render time from the 14900K by an actually meaningful 16.5%. So finally, some uplift. These types of tests are also where AMD 7800X3D and 5800X3D show their limits as 8-core CPUs, both falling far down the charts. That's a known quantity at this point. If you're only gaming, they make the most sense. If you mix in a good amount of heavily threaded software for work, it may make more sense to buy something else on the list. In file compression with 7-zip, the 285K completed 170,000 MIPS and roughly tied with the i7 14700K. The 14900K holds an advantage of 8%. The 9950X and 7950X outperform the 285K significantly, with the 9900X just behind. Memory seemed to really help in this test, pushing the 285K up by a gargantuan 18.7%, which is a huge uplift. Decompression doesn't benefit as much, posting a 4% improvement for the memory. The stack also shuffles, with the 9900X and 7900X both surpassing the 285K here. The memory subsystem benefits don't translate as much as they did in compression, both stock and with better RAM. The 14900K leads the 285K by a staggering 21% in this benchmark, benefiting from its extra threads. The 9950X establishes an impressive ceiling at 42% ahead of the 285K. Next is our Chromium code compile test. For this test, we double the RAM capacity on some CPUs when they page out or otherwise fail to complete the compile. This only occurs with the highest performing few CPUs on the chart. This test has been updated since the last round, so load on CPUs has slightly changed. In the situation of the 9950X, there's one disclaimer here. We were not able to get it stable at DDR5 6000 with 64 gigabytes when running our usual tighter timings. We experimented briefly with loosening the timings, raising the voltages, and reducing the Infinity Fabric. None of that really worked, and so we ended up keeping everything the same, but pulling the frequency down to DDR5 5600 to accommodate 64 gigabytes. We have to call it there for now. We'll look into that more later. So that makes the 9950X an imperfect comparison. With that limitation disclosed due to the stability issues, the 9950X and 285K are roughly equal. That may change if we can rerun the 9950X and find stability. For direct comparisons, the 285K leads the 14900K by only about a 3-minute time reduction, or a total compile time requirement reduction of 3.8%. As usual, the 8-core X3D parts are lower down the stack, like the 78 and 58 X3Ds. Now we're testing the Adobe software with the Puget suite, kind of like how the Adobe software tests my patience every single day by it existing. Premiere has the 285K as the new chart topper at 11,336 points. That's how this whole review should have been, especially with the power reduction, and unfortunately it was not. The lead over the 14900K is small at 2.5% uplift in aggregate. The 9950X is AMD's top CPU here at 10,914 points. The 285K therefore has a 3.9% lead. In Adobe Photoshop, AMD has a clean sweep of the entire top half of the charts. Those of you who've been watching us for at least 5 years will remember an era where it was actually the opposite. The first Intel entry doesn't appear until below the 7600X, and that's the 14900K. The 9950X leads the 285K by 22% here, and the 14900K leads it by 3.5%. Simplifying all this, we had some more data too for spec and stuff like that, but it kind of all comes out the same way, which is the 285K does not have a particularly strong place in the market with its competitors right now, including Intel's own competition, which is lower in price than it used to be. The 7800 X3D is far superior in both gaming and efficiency. The 285 hardly makes any sense even against the 5700 X3D, and AMD's 9800 X3D is days away at this point. For non-gaming, the CPU is more interesting, but we still don't think it's broadly justifiable at the current CPU and platform costs. Even Intel's prior gen parts are far cheaper right now, like the 13700K and 14700K, which theoretically have been fixed with microcode. If you were to argue that the inefficiency of the prior gen parts counters some of the savings in the form of lower power, being lower cost because of lower power, it's just not a strong argument. The 14700K is $350 now, so it's $280 cheaper than a 285K. If your power costs 10 cents per kilowatt hour like ours, then you need to play the highest CPU load games for 8 hours a day for an entire year in order to gain $19 of value in power bill reductions for the 285K against the 14700K. At 15 cents, the shut-in gaming levels would give the 285K a savings of $30 over 1 year of literally playing Starfield or Cyberpunk as a full-time job. At the peak of degeneracy that we all strive to achieve, you'd have to play games at this pace for 10 years straight to have spent more on power than the cost savings of buying the cheaper CPU. It's the delta, not the total cost. Maybe throw in a cheaper cooler as well, since the power's down. Call it 8 years. Even at 30 cents per kilowatt hour, the $280 price savings of the 14700K would require 5 years to wipe out the power bill while playing Cyberpunk 8 hours a day for 5 years, or in other words, 14,560 hours of Cyberpunk. Let's just say you pay 50 cents per kilowatt hour. In one standard 3-year upgrade cycle, you can save the amount of money and power you'd save buying the 14700K, which we still don't recommend for gaming, by the way. We're just using it as an example. That'd be a savings of $93 per year or so at 307.7 minus 215.1, or you go with the 7800 X3D and get higher frame rates and still a power cost reduction even at these high electricity prices of $114 per year at these crazy gaming hours. And if we ignore all of the cost and we say it's purely about stewardship for the environment, then the 7800 X3D still makes way more sense because it's just lower power. So it is good that Intel has improved over its prior CPUs, but this truly is a building block type of situation. There needs to be more before it's truly competitive in that department enough where you just point to the one thing and you say, yeah, that's the reason you buy it. So it's not there yet. The reduction in power consumption is important though. Objectively, Intel's more efficient than it used to be. It's just that the regressive performance in games, if you look at some of these, is hard to deal with, and it does kind of eat some of that efficiency gain away. Production performance is also mostly improved considering the lower thread count, so that actually is great, and some of the performance gains for the thread reduction is impressive here, like in Blender. The problem is that at $630, there are very few cases where the 285K makes sense right now. The conclusions are going to depend on the types of reviewers you watch. We focus on the value. That means the money is always a factor in the equation for the most part of whether a product is worth it or not, and we can't get away from the price on the 285K. There really are not many good cases you could make for it in competition with the higher-end gaming parts from AMD or even Intel's prior generation parts. Again, even considering all the efficiency stuff, the cost argument is just not there for the Ultra 200 series right now. So that means for us, we need to see a strong value argument to recommend a part. We do not see that currently with the 285K. We'll look at the 245K next and see if that's any different. It is easier to hit higher memory clocks than before, so that was kind of cool. We might do some additional memory tuning on that. And the benefits in tests like 7-zip show up in those scenarios. Of course, you can tune everything else too, but we just think there are better CPUs for the price right now. Make it really simple for everyone. For gaming, the 7800 X3D makes the most sense. Now, when it's $600 or it's stupid prices because you're getting scalped, don't buy it. Just wait, especially with the 9800 X3D around the corner. We don't know what that'll be priced yet. We'll see. Rumors are all over the place for it. But it just X3D makes more sense, basically. If you're on AM4, the 5700 X3D is great. If you're on, say, 3000 or 2000 or something, you can save a lot of money that way. You don't get all the fun of building a new machine, but you save a lot. And then for Intel competition, the prior generation parts, if all the issues have fully been resolved, and we've tested the microcode, it does look better. It's just that we're not really going to know for a while because that's a delayed issue. But anyway, those parts are a lot cheaper now too. So those kind of make more sense in most scenarios. There are places the 285K is impressive, but they are really not enough to justify buying it. So that's going to be it for our review of this one. Thanks for watching. The power testing stuff was really fun and made the process interesting for us. And then we've got 245K and 265K coming up. And subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net if you want to support our in-depth testing. We're basically majority funded by the audience at this point, which is great because it reduces our reliance on ads as well. And you can head over to the store to help us out, or patreon.com/gamersnexus to throw a few bucks a month our way. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.